I was editing my 2024 reel and I noticed that most of my favorite stuff I shot in the last year was all on vintage lenses. And I had the bright idea to compare my modern 50mm lens against a vintage Canon FD 50mm and a FD 55mm f1.2 and figure out, okay, what are the differences between these lenses? What about the vintage ones make me like that footage more? Turns out there's not a huge difference. I'm really surprised by that. So here's the first shot with the Canon FD 50mm f1.8 and then the Lumix 50mm f1.8. Going between them, the vintage lens has a much more of a cooler tone to it. It's got lower contrast, more vignette, and this particular lens, there's more of a soap bubble character in the bokeh. Then if we go to the 55mm f1.2, there's obviously way more bokeh because it's an f1.2, which is why I missed focus. And then it's got even lower contrast and more of a blue tint to it. But once we color correct all of these, they all look surprisingly similar. It's just the starting point is different. Here we've got the FD 50mm versus the Lumix 50mm, then the Canon FD 55 at f2, and then 55 at f1.2. And again, once we apply a grade and bring those shadows back down on the vintage lenses, all these lenses actually match really well. I expected to see a stronger difference between these three. Going to a sharpness test, no surprise, the vintage lenses are much softer, wide open, but you stop them down to 2.8 and they look pretty clean. There's definitely a lot of color fringing around the in-focus areas on this lens. The Lumix 50mm has a lot of that same color fringing, but is much sharper, wide open. And then at 2.8, that fringing mostly goes away. The f1.2 55mm has a ton of bloom in it, way more chromatic aberration, and is fairly soft, but then you stop it down to f2, it cleans up, and by 2.8, it's actually surprisingly sharp and clean. Then I figured let's test the flares. So here's the Canon FD 50mm. The Lumix 50mm has a much more controlled flare. And then the 55 has, I think, the coolest looking flare with that little orange touch. Looking at the shape of the bokeh, the vintage lenses definitely have more of a cat's eye football type shape, where the Lumix stays rounder. But overall, a really surprisingly similar performance across the three. The vintage lenses both show more of a bloom around the highlights, even when they're in focus, where the Lumix lens is cleaner. So overall, there's not a whole lot of difference here. The main things I'm seeing are that bloom, a little lower contrast, kind of like having a mist filter in the lens a little bit, lower sharpness overall, and more vignette, slightly different bokeh character, but for the most part, they're really, really similar. I think really, to me, it probably comes down to the experience of using a all-manual vintage lens versus a modern autofocus lens. It's just a very different experience. So I'll keep using these, especially on the Blackmagic, but now I don't really feel like I have to use vintage lenses to get a certain look when I've already got this with me.